talk about the rock candy revolution. On February 12, 2011, I woke up at 3 a.m. in the morning from a sound sleep with 3 images in my head. The first was Abraham Lincoln, who was born 202 years before on that same February 12th, but in 1809. The second image related to what had happened just the night before, or the day before, when kind of the climax of the Egyptian uprising with Mubarak basically giving up his power, and as Jane McGonigal would have referred to it, game over for Mubarak. Definitely an epic win for the Egyptian people. And the third image was how to make rock candy. So these are kind of disconnected, as Beryl talked about, and I wanted to try to see the connections between those 3 different images. So I'm laying in the bed, kind of tossing and turning and thinking, okay, how are these connected? And after about 60 minutes at 4 a.m., I got up, walked down the hall to my office, opened up my laptop, and started typing a Facebook note about these connections. And I reserved a domain name called rockcandyrevolution.org. Now, to understand why a person would do that at 4 a.m. in the morning, I have to tell you a bit about my own backstory. So from 1997 to 2006, I was CEO of Shop.com, and during that time, we grew the number of users to our site from 0 users to 500,000 users in 9 years. I kind of patted myself on the back. That's a pretty good accomplishment, 500,000 people, until I read the story of iLike. Now, iLike this is their invite page on Facebook. They were a Facebook app, and they launched in May of 2007 when Facebook had about 30 million users. And they grew their app's daily traffic from 0 users to 500,000 users in 9 hours. And so I said, what am I doing wrong? Clearly the founders of iLike had stumbled onto something. They, in essence, put this music sharing app into this super saturated solution of Facebook users who liked music but didn't really have any apps to use, and it spread like wildfire. And they, in essence, invented something new about how to do global software distribution. So on February 11th, the night before, when I watched this kind of like amazingly efficient way in which the Egyptian people had taken back their country in 18 days, I realized that they too had invented something new in the way in which you would crystallize consensus, coordinate collaborations, and change the world. That concept of crystallized consensus and coordinate collaborations, that's what got me thinking about rock candy, because that mirrors some of the steps involved in the process of making rock candy. If you don't remember this from science class or cooking or whatever type of class you might have seen this, you start rock candy with a cup of water in a saucepan, and then you pour 3 cups of sugar into that water. Now at room temperature, that much sugar is not going to dissolve in water like that. You have to heat it up and stir it, and as you do that, all of that sugar will dissolve into solution, and then you can add whatever food color you want or flavoring. But the really interesting part happens when you pour it off into a jar and it begins to cool. And as it begins to cool, you have a jar which basically still looks like essentially water with some food coloring in it, but it's really a super saturated solution. And what that means is all of those 3 cups of sugar that are now dissolved, they want to come out of solution, but there's not like that next step that allows them to do that. And so they'll just sit there for as long as you'll let them sit there. And so in the process of making rock candy, creating that super saturated solution takes about 30 minutes. If you're talking about a country, it takes longer. In the case of Egypt, it took them about 30 years from when Mubarak came to power in 1981, when Egypt had a population of 37 million, to create a super saturated solution. And obviously at that time, the cell phone was invented about 30 years ago, so there weren't any of those, and the internet was around but not really popular, maybe on DARPANET or something, and then there was no social media, at least online social media. So, but over the next 30 years, a lot changed. Into that mix, basically, was added advances in technology. And the advances in technology in terms of cell phones, the internet, and social media all came to be in those next 30 years. But also, you had 45 million new people in the population during that time period. And that created a super saturated solution. And that solution was one in which 2/3 of the population was under the age of 30 and very adept at using all of these new tools for coordinating actions with one another. However, there was, although there were periodic revolts and riots and things like that, there was never anything until this recent revolution that really coalesced into something significant. In essence, you had the millions of people in the population that were held in check by this barrier of fear, and that barrier of fear was created by the police brutality and the torture and the corruption that existed. So something would have to change in order to kind of tip that. And so that's what brings us back to the rock candy revolution. We've got this supersaturated solution, and the thing that causes that to change is you insert a seed crystal. It's basically some kind of template or organizing structure. In this case, it's a pipe cleaner on a pencil, and you insert that down into the rock candy solution, which is now, and it will begin to change. And what happens essentially is you provided a template where all of the billions of sugar molecules can now have something to form around. And so they begin to form around that pipe cleaner. And this is after about 24 hours. If you lift it out, sure enough, they're starting to form on the pipe cleaner, just like you want if you want to make rock candy. That organizing principle is guiding them in terms of how to do it. Now, there's a problem, though, that you have to monitor this process and kind of coordinate the collaborations of these crystals, because otherwise there'll be some that form on the surface, and as the days go on, there'll be some that actually form on the sides of the jar. And so you can change the jar. And what you want to do is keep monitoring the process so that as many as possible of the sugar molecules organize themselves around your original seed crystal. And that basically, coordinating those collaborations over time, you get to the point where after a number of days, you get this kind of beautiful result, which is, out comes this kind of amazing thing, which started in what looked like, a jar of water that had a certain food color, and then, 7 days later, you pull out this, piece of rock candy. And so that transition is almost magical, and it's actually very unexpected. And it kind of, to me, is sort of the excuse for why the world's press and the world's leaders and the leaders in Egypt, and actually even probably the Egyptian people, didn't necessarily recognize that, on June 10th, 2010, that, some big change was coming in Egypt. But something happened on that day that kind of did change everything. And what that was, as was mentioned earlier, was there was a Facebook page that was created. And so into this supersaturated solution of state-sanctioned suffering and discontent, you all of a sudden had this organizing principle, which is the We Are All Khaled Said Facebook page. And what that page was about this man who's a 28-year-old man in Alexandria that two police basically beat and tortured and killed. And he hadn't done anything wrong, and there was no actions that were taken against the police. So the question was, what could be done about this? Well, Wael Ghonim and a number of other page admins created this Facebook page with the idea of rallying Egyptians around not regime change, but the concept of let's just treat people with dignity and end police brutality in Egypt. And that was something that men and women in Egypt could relate to, and people of all classes in Egypt could relate to. So they began a process of updating the Facebook fan page. This process continued from June until, and this is actually what the page image was on January 17th. In that time period, they grew from 0 users that had liked that Facebook fan page to 500,000 users in about an 8-month time period. And those users had been posting videos on the page, posting their own stories of abuse in the government. And just like the crystals sort of forming on one another, as more and more people joined that page, it became safer and safer for more and more additional people to join into the cause. And so you had this scenario where they were ready, basically, to call, and they kind of announced their revolution. This is probably unprecedented in history, but they announced this revolution saying, okay, on January 25th, we're all going to come out and this is what showed up on January 25th. And if you actually go and look on the Facebook page, and anyone can do this, you can read the Facebook notes on those individual days, and you can say, okay, let's meet at Tahrir Square. Here's what you're supposed to do. Here's what you're not supposed to do. And so they have all of these rules and ways in which they wanted this revolution to unfold as a nonviolent revolution. So obviously that process continued, and Tahrir Square, which was empty, just a few slides ago, is now packed with people. And the page admins are essentially monitoring this process and using the Facebook page and Twitter and the other social media tools throughout the revolution to kind of coordinate those collaborations. And this became critical at certain points in the revolution when Mubarak kind of famously, his paid thugs kind of attacked the square on horses and camels, and they were trying to, in essence, it was a trap that Mubarak was setting for the protesters, that if they could get them to react to this violent provocation and turn back with violence, then they would be able to justify, okay, well, let's send in the army to kind of quell the revolution, and Mubarak might have been able to stay in power. But they were able to use this Facebook page kind of behind the scenes to continue to coordinate the protesters, calm them down, and say, no, let's stay true to our nonviolent principles. And so you had these amazing scenes where this is just a couple days later, you had thousands of Muslims protecting thousands of Christians while they were in prayer. And then you had thousands of Christians protecting thousands of Muslims while they were in prayer. And then it became pretty clear that it was only Mubarak who was without a prayer. And a few days later, dreams came true and the regime ended. And this was in essence an epic win as far as the first stages of the revolution were concerned. Beginning stage of removing Mubarak, but also ending torture and corruption. The other things in terms of poverty and unemployment, those will take longer, as will democracy, and then functioning democracy, and then prosperity. But it really inspired me to say, okay, can we use these same tools to, I'm kind of a startup guy, is there a way to help, in my own little way, sitting here in Monterey, to kind of help encourage a process of entrepreneurial innovation and startups in Egypt? And so I created this Facebook fan page on February 12th, which was about the rock candy revolution, and I started inviting people to the page. And over about 18 days, 100,000 people had come and become fans of this page. And what's amazing to me about it, and really just shows the power of these social media tools, is that the vast majority of those people speak Arabic or French or some of the other languages that are in the Arab-speaking world in that neck of the woods. It's very few Americans that are on this page. And it really, and very early in the process, I had people from Egypt who wanted to be page admins, and of course, like Tom Sawyer, I just kind of gave them the brush and they could start painting the fence as well. And so now there's 5 or 6 admins, and the page has a life of its own. It's up to about 150,000 people right now. It's very important that everyone here, you may not have a government that you want to change, or you might, I don't know exactly the situation you're in, but these same tools can be applied because what they really represent is a success pattern. And one of the things that's interesting about this particular revolution is you could call it a leaderless revolution because there's no leader out front. Like in the civil rights movement, you had Martin Luther King giving these great speeches. There really isn't that same type of phenomenon. So, I kind of just had to imagine, what if, 87 hours after the revolution on February 14th, if there were 800 people that died during this revolution. And what if they had asked Abraham Lincoln, if he'd been born an Egyptian and was alive today, to give the dedication remarks at Tahrir Square? And so it's always dangerous when you edit Lincoln, but I wrote or modified this. I'll read it to you. It says, 87 hours ago, our fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters brought forth on this continent a new Egypt, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men and women are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great social media war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. The rest of the words from Lincoln's most famous speech didn't require any updating at all. And it really is kind of amazing that the success pattern that was laid down in 1863 with those words apply today. And what is also heartening, actually, is that in the American Civil War, 620,000 people died. In the Egyptian Revolution, 800 people died. And I think part of the reason is that these new social media tools allow us to amplify the volume of an individual's voice, and they allow us to accelerate the rate of change so that the amount of carnage that actually occurs when people rise up to claim their freedom and dignity doesn't have to be as much as it was in the past. So the other thing that, and this is how I'll close basically, is the other aspect of what the rock candy revolution in Egypt did was it gave us an existence proof that essentially with almost no paid staff, no huge budget, a very tiny group of people could rally millions of people, and not just people who were like an unorganized mob, but a purpose-driven people who could basically use their collective power to improve the lives of millions of people on this planet. So whether your problem is at the scale of a city, a county, a country, or a continent, I believe that you too can experience this kind of epic win if you walk like an Egyptian, and if you employ these rock candy revolution techniques to crystallize consensus, coordinate collaborations, and change the world. Thanks.